Thank you for coming to my presentation. My name is Hilary Barlow, and this is Open Archives, connecting digital archives to the open education movement. So I'm going to tell you a bit about myself because this will inform why I chose to conduct this research. So I started my career working part-time as a library paraprofessional and part-time as an archives paraprofessional. And this was for economic necessity. I kind of just needed the hours and the money. But it kind of set me up for a lot later. So when I did my master's degree, I chose an archives track at the University of Toronto I School, but I also took library courses. I'm originally from the United States, but I currently live and work in Canada and have for some time. And I have held both archivist and librarian positions. And so this puts me at a unique intersection where I can observe trends in both the library and the archives field. And because I've worked in the United States and Canada, I can observe trends in both countries as well. Between 2020 and 2022, I worked on a very open education heavy project. I provided metadata support for a repository of French as a second language open educational resources that was being created by York University's Glendon campus. In 2022, I was hired for a research position at York University's main campus here in Toronto. And for my research project, I started thinking about the intersection of archival practice, special collections librarianship, and open education. So I'm going to hit you with some definitions here because I want everyone to be on the same page. This is from the Society of American Archivists. The word archives refers to the permanently valuable records such as letters, reports, accounts, minute books, draft and final manuscripts, and photographs of people, businesses, and government. These records are kept because they have continuing value to the creating agency and to other potential users. They are the documentary evidence of past events. They are the facts we use to interpret and understand history. Archivists do a lot. Archivists seek out records, communicate with donating individuals and agencies about adding records to their collection, store them, preserve them, organize them so they can be easily used by researchers. But I'm going to focus a bit on one big thing that archivists do. This is also from the Society of American Archivists. Archivists identify the essential evidence of our society and ensure its availability for use by students, teachers, researchers, organization leaders, historians, and a wide range of individuals with information needs. Many archivists also plan and direct exhibitions, publications, and other outreach programs to broaden the use of collections, helping people find and understand the information they need. So archival items are unique, and often, if you're consulting an archival record in archives, it's the original record. Not all the time, and some are, there's some collections that are from government records that were distributed a lot of different places, but a lot of times you're looking at the original record. And there are some cases where archives will make facsimiles, including digital facsimiles to put online. Archival records are also frequently unpublished, in contrast to library collections, which are typically of published works. And there are some cases where archives own the copyright of the records that they hold. This is not typically the case, and this impacts what the archives can do with the records and also what they can allow researchers to do with the records legally. And sometimes it's not even clear who the intellectual property owner is. Many archives contain orphan works or items where it's not clear who the intellectual property owner actually is. Archival records also require different storage and access practices from library items. So you can see in this image, this is from the Clara Thomas Archives and Special Collections at York University. And this is what archival stacks often look like. You can see there are boxes, and this is often how archival records are stored. And it's quite different from, say, like a collection of library books would be stored. And access practices are also different. So you can't check out archival records. If you want to consult them, you have to go to the archives and consult them there. And that's because, unlike, say, a public library, where typically if you check out a book and you lose it, you pay a fee, and the library can purchase another copy. And again, a lot of times archival records are the original thing. So if you bring it home and you lose it, that's it. And archives can't take that chance. A lot of archival records contain private and identifiable information because remember they're not published. They haven't been approved for the public. The archivists have to think about that. So they can be things like full names, addresses, medical information, potentially embarrassing personal information. And again, that goes into access policies. What can we let the public see? Can we let some people see it, but not allow them to copy or restrict? Or maybe some things we won't let people see at all until after, for example, the donor has passed for a couple of certain amount of years. An archivist must consider the sensitivities of donors, whether they're individuals or agencies, because archives need to show that they're reliable and can be trusted with the donor's records, and maintaining those relationships is very important. Another important concept in archives is original order. An original order is the order that the archival records were in when they were either in possession of the individual or when they were in use and storage by the organization that created them. That's because the order that the archival records are in can tell you a lot about how they're used, about the record's role in the overall organization or life of the person that the record represents. And this becomes relevant when it comes to things like remixing with regard to OER. That's why archivists and special collections librarians are understandably hesitant to allow their resources to be remixed. This is another definition. I want to talk about special collections. Special collections is a bit of an umbrella term. So archives can be part of special collections. Well, anyway, I'll just read it. Special collections comprise manuscripts and archival collections unduplicated elsewhere, and one-of-a-kind or rarely held books. They also include items precious through their rarity, monetary value, or their association with important figures or institutions in history, culture, politics, sciences, or the arts. Special collections extended beyond paper to other formats of cultural significance. For example, photographs, moving pictures, architectural drawings, and digital archives. And that is from the Association of Research Libraries. So special collections, and actually archives as well, can be multi-format collections. They can include audiovisual materials like the film reels you see in this image, and physical objects. There are sometimes rare book collections that kind of look like what you'd see in your public library, but the books are either too rare or too old to circulate. So again, you have to look at them at the Special Collections Library. And different formats have different preservation, access, and storage needs. So you can see with these film reels, you wouldn't store them like you would textual records, and that can mean literally the containers they're in, but it can also mean things like the temperature of the room that is ideal so that they will degrade slower and can last longer. All sorts of considerations like these. And financial resources and staff time are always an issue. Archives and libraries are often turned to as the thing that can be cut when finances are rough at an organization. And so archivists and librarians are always being asked to do more with less. And that influences things like digitization projects. Archives and libraries have to consider if they even have the resources to do big digitization projects. And they have to think about, well, if we are going to do one, what are we going to prioritize? What are we going to digitize? And typically it's a thing where either it's out of copyright or the archives owns the copyright, because then it's just a lot easier. They don't have to worry about legal action or getting in trouble if they digitize and share online something that they shouldn't. And that influences what is seen. The archival profession and special collections librarianship are distinct fields, but they're overlapping in many ways, and they share a lot of the same concerns. Both archivists and special collections librarians share their materials online, again, where considerations of copyright and privacy are always paramount. So where does open education fit in here? So my research began with the observation that my library colleagues talked about open education and open educational resources way more often than my archivist colleagues. And that led to the question, is this because open education is inherently incompatible with archives and special collections? Because, again, of the unique considerations that these materials have that I talked to earlier in this presentation. Archives and special collections materials are already shared online, but could they be shared as open educational resources, or was that a bridge too far? I don't see this as a critique of the fields at all, but rather an invitation to conversation. I want to talk about what is possible. So this is a table created by my colleague Stephanie Quayle at York University. It's adapted from the OER Starter Kit. You can see at the very, very top left corner, it says OER. And you can see that OER are openly licensed, freely available, and modifiable. Go down a little bit, you see free online resources under all rights reserved copyright. So the bottom three rows, this is the conditions under which digital archival and special collections materials might be shared as what's going on now. So for free online resources under all rights reserved copyright, not openly licensed, but freely available, not modifiable. Non-open access materials available through the library, not openly licensed or modifiable, and only available to certain groups, typically, for example, in a university archives or special collections library, that would be students, faculty, and staff. And then you can't see entirely because of my head, but open access materials and monographs. Open access is a very popular concept in the archives and library field. So these are openly licensable and freely available, but they might not be modifiable. And of course, this goes to remixing, which is a big part of the concept in the open education movement with open educational resources. And again, this is a space because of things like original order, where archivists and special collections librarians might be hesitant to take the jump of making their collections into open educational resources. So thinking about this, I wanted to talk to my colleagues. I want to ask them, is this too far a jump to think of archives and special collections materials as potentially OER? And so I conducted 22 case study interviews, asked 23 open-ended questions. I wanted my interviewees to feel comfortable being frank with me. So I gave them a lot of leeway in choosing their level of anonymity. They could choose to be quoted by name, quoted anonymously, or not quoted at all. And so later in the presentation, you'll see some quotes from my colleagues. And if they don't have a name attached, that's because they chose to not have their name attached. And so, like I said, I'm originally from the United States, but for most of my career, I've lived in Ontario, and that's a bit of a bias. Most of the colleagues that I know well are here in Ontario. So I did interview 15 people from Ontario, but I also interviewed 3 people from Quebec and 1 each from British Columbia, Manitoba, and Nova Scotia. And just to see if an American would have a different take, American besides me, I interviewed someone in my home state of Pennsylvania. I interviewed 11 archivists, 7 librarians, 2 paraprofessionals, and 2 scholars. The scholars were academics who would engage heavily with open educational resources, including making them, and who were also very familiar with using digital archival and special collections databases for their research. And I won't talk about them as much, but I interviewed them for kind of a comparison. I also wanted the group to be professionally diverse because practices can be different within the profession depending on what your specialty is. So I talked to a map librarian, an audiovisual archivist, a rare books librarian, and some other people in some other subspecialties. And I've mostly worked in university settings, which is another bias. So I did talk to colleagues in university settings, but I also try to talk to people in other settings, including public institutions. I talked to one person who managed special collections in a large public library system and in museums. I started my interviews by establishing interviews' familiarity with OE concepts and practices. So I asked how familiar they were with the open education movement in general, open educational resources, and Creative Commons. And I wanted to know, like, was my initial observation correct? Would librarians be more familiar with OE than archivists? So here is a graph representing familiarity with the open education movement overall. The librarians are the red, and you can see they have a wide range of familiarity. The archivists are the orange, and they tended to be less familiar, but there were still some that had a medium level of familiarity. The yellow is the two paraprofessionals that I interviewed, and their familiarity ranged a lot. As you can see, there was one person who was low to medium and one who was medium to high. This is specifically familiarity with open educational resources. And because that is the product of the OE movement that most people are familiar with, at least most people in archives and libraries, librarians are the very dark blue, and again, varied, there's a wide range. Archivists, again, more toward less familiarity, there's some in the middle. Paraprofessionals, I got one in medium and one very high. I had interviewed one paraprofessional who had worked extensively with an OER database. So they were highly proficient when it came to open educational resources, really knew what they were talking about. And this graph is about Creative Commons, including Creative Commons licenses. The librarians are the very dark green, and here you can see, in my opinion, a bigger difference between librarians and archivists. Librarians had at least medium familiarity with Creative Commons. A fair amount had high familiarity. The archivists tended a bit to their lower familiarity, but as you can see, there's a decent amount of archivists who were medium to high. And both my paraprofessionals very adept with Creative Commons. And I also asked, do you assign Creative Commons licenses to your own work? And to clarify, some practitioners would upload to digital repositories archival and special collections materials, and with those they might add Creative Commons licenses to the materials. I'm not asking about that here. I'm asking about your own work, blog posts, journal articles, conference presentations, stuff like that. So here, can't see entirely because of my head, but a little over a quarter of the archivists said yes. Librarians, close to 3/4 said yes. This is the biggest difference between librarians and archivists, was use of Creative Commons licenses. Both of the paraprofessionals said no, but they were quite likely to assign Creative Commons licenses to items in digital collections. Next, I wanted to see how receptive interviewees would be to integrating OE principles to their work, or if they already had. Because some people surprised me like, oh, we already do that, which is amazing, but mostly that wasn't the case. So I asked things like, what do you think about the idea of a digital archivist aiding in long-term digital preservation of OER repositories? What would you think about incorporating OE principles into donor agreements and trying to encourage donors to have their materials be made available freely online? But the biggest question I asked, and what I was most interested in people hearing, most interested in hearing answers to, was, do you think digital archival and special collections materials could be potentially shared as OER? People had a lot of things to say about it. So practitioners recognized the potential to the idea. Generally, people were at least somewhat open, but they were cognizant of copyright, donor agreements, and the resources necessary to make something like that possible. So an archivist in Nova Scotia said, I do think that the potential is there. Michael Moyer, who's the university archivist at York, said there's no point in us preserving them unless the material is discoverable and being used, and them being the materials. So some interviews kind of pushed back at me a bit, which I liked, and said, are we already doing this? Like, maybe we don't use the same terminology. Maybe we, as the OE movement, but aren't we kind of already doing this? Which I appreciated. An archivist in Manitoba said, a lot of objects already are being shared in that way through the attribution of Creative Commons licenses. An archives and library paraprofessional here in Ontario said, well, I think they certainly can be, and I believe they already are. I think that they aren't really being promoted that way. Many interviewees were enthusiastic while mindful of the existing best practices that had served them in their work. Archives paraprofessional in Ontario said, I don't have a problem with the concept of people remixing and doing whatever, but I do have a problem with not linking back to where you got it from or the original source material. An academic librarian in Ontario said, hell yes, open license it, but let's be attentive to the terms of the license. So in conclusion, archivists, special collections librarians, and paraprofessionals show a wide range of familiarity with OE, OER, and Creative Commons. Librarians are on average slightly more familiar, especially when it comes to Creative Commons. Digital archival and special collections, the fields are broadly aligned with the spirit of open education. They might not use the same terminology as in the open education movement. What they put out on the internet might not necessarily strictly be OER by the definition, but they're on the same wavelength. While cognizant that restrictions such as copyright remain as important as ever, all groups show some interest and openness to incorporating OE and OER. So the next stage of my research is an anonymous survey. So building on the results of my case study, I want to launch an anonymous survey because I'd like to see if a larger group of practitioners will respond similarly. Because I only interviewed 22 people. When we got into a lot of depth, it's still only 22 people. And you can take my survey. I'm especially looking for input from archivists, special collections librarians, and paraprofessionals who have engaged in digital materials in some way on the job. You do not have to have experience with OE, OER, and so you can complete my survey at tinyurl.com/openarchives. In the event that I have to pause it or take it down, I will instead have an update on the status of it at this link. But regardless, this is the link to my survey. Please take it if, especially if you fall under those specifications. And these are my graphics credits. And I want to thank my interviewees, all of my colleagues who helped by looking at drafts of various things I was creating for this research. And thank you so much for watching today.